longtime educator in the city of Chicago, Brother Patrick. Also good to see Representative Monique Davis in the audience. You know, when, that's right, veteran black teacher. When, you know, I would go down to Springfield and you know, it was like nobody was listening to us. It was always somebody who would say, come to me and say, baby, you're doing the right thing. All right, man. All right. You know, baby, you're doing the right thing. Don't give up. And lots of times we overstate what those things mean to you when you're in the middle of a fight, because everybody who has succumbed to the dark side is telling you that you can't do it, or there's something wrong with you for wanting some dignity for your children, or how dare you suggest that children on 43rd should get the same education as children in Lakeview. Are you crazy? You know, and so it's always good, I was going to say that to you, Representative, it's always good to have people that know and support you when you're fighting a good fight. And I want to say this to everybody in the audience. It's time to stop straddling the fence. It's time, I mean, I'm serious, I'm not trying to talk tough. You know, there has to be an insult level. There has to be an insult level. And I don't profess to be, you know, some great intellectual or anything like that. But what I am is accountable. And when I looked at those children in my neighborhood, when I was in New Orleans and I looked at those babies in New Orleans and went to Detroit, I saw those babies in Detroit, I saw myself. And said that means we have to take our work to the next level, because they deserve to be safe. They deserve to be able to stand on our shoulders. So I want to just make a quick suggestion to the folks who took notes or facilitated in all of our sessions to please lay out our specific policy recommendations, so that when we talk after, in a little bit, when we talk, we can really talk about specifically the policy recommendations we want to start moving forward in those different areas. And we also want to begin to connect issues. So lots of times we talk about education because that's where we are, but a very wise man shared with us in our session that, you know, we should be talking about quality of life, not just education. Now, education, we know, is kind of where, you know, kind of the benchmark of the community, but we also have to talk about economic development. We also have to talk about employment opportunities. We have to talk about housing. We have to talk about quality of life. So as we move forward, let's begin to be welcoming to brothers and sisters who work in those areas, because we have to bring, because what it's really about is common principles. It's not the issue is not even the point. If you talk to people that are fighting for affordable housing, you hear a lot of the same things we've been saying. If you talk to people that's fighting for the end of food deserts, we're linked in principle. So the next phase of our work, as we turn the temperature up in this fight, the next phase of this work is to make sure that we are able to connect with our brothers and sisters across issues and build a movement around, you know, just think about this. We deserve better.
That's right.
In every area, we deserve better. You know? So the brother that I'm getting ready to introduce, I could bring his bio up here. I have it. I can read the brother's bio. But I think there's something more important to say about this man. He, was grounded in civil rights struggle for many years, was director of education for the NAACP. I remember seeing him speak once, because a friend of mine, a brother by the name of Rasul Moai, used to work with the NAACP down in Champaign, and I heard the brother speak once. I thought, that brother's sharp. And I was down there working with young people in the Juvenile Detention Center. And then when I began doing national education organizing, I met him as the president of the Schott Foundation. Here's what I think is most important for you to know about Dr. John Jackson. A lot of us get in positions of influence, and we forget that we all a check away. We get in those positions of influence, and we feel that now that gives us the authority to tell people what they should and should not be doing. Or you need to pull yourself up, like I did, right? And so it's refreshing to have somebody in that position who makes it his business to ensure that organizations are prepared to take their work to the next level. I've had that personal experience with that brother. I've sat down with him and talked about the work that we're trying to do. And you see that sincerity, you see that willingness to open doors, that ability to listen and hear people. And that's critical, because to any organizer, the most important quality is the ability to listen. Not, say it again. To any organizer, I don't care how many books you've read about, organizing, labor organizing, political organizing, the most important quality of an organizer is to shut up and listen. And learn from the people that may have less than you material. Because there are lessons that there's a brother, sister in here right now. Where's Kayla? Put your hand up, sister. All right. That's Fannie Lou Hamer's great niece. What? But the lesson that Fannie Lou Hamer teaches us, Fannie Lou Hamer had a 3rd grade education. She had a 3rd grade education. So in this work is not about the credentials we walk in the door with. Amen. It's not. That's right. It's about what's in here. Yes, it's about what's in here. So here's how I feel about Dr. Jackson. And I'm not saying this because he's a fun, because if anybody knows me, they know that I'm blunt. And I'm not that diplomatic, so a lot of times I can have a slip of the tongue. But I will say this, Malcolm X said something that I think is one of his greatest quotes. He said, "I'm not a particularly educated man, nor am I an expert in any field, but I'm sincere, and my sincerity is my credential." And I think that embodies, now this brother is educated, he is particularly skilled, but he's sincere. He's sincere. So I want you all to give a round of applause to the president of the Schott Foundation, Dr. John Jackson.
Good afternoon. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and this is my hometown. First, I want to thank Jitu for the introduction. And Jitu and I talk often, and whether it's by phone or whether it's the south side of Chicago, I learned so much from him. And learning is a part of what's necessary in order for me to do my job, and in order for all of us to take on the challenge that we have to take on in providing all students an opportunity to learn. So, G2, I appreciate your accountability, because I think that that's very important. It's something you said, we've got to be accountable. And if you feel responsible for the young people in your community, the things that happen to them are not just accidents. We believe that we control a lot of what happens, and I know that you too takes it very serious when things get out of control and negatively impact young people. This is historic. The ability to have Rainbow Push, Advancement Project, Journey for Justice, members of the labor community, the faith community come together is always powerful. And I've said this before, there's more power in this room right now than there is in the White House, than there is in Springfield, than there is in Baton Rouge. More power. And we've got to recognize how then do we execute that power. So it's great to be home. I grew up, I attended Frank L. Gillespie Elementary School right there on 95th. It's great to be home. And it's great that you all are taking the time to invest the time to talk about how do we get around our young people, our young leaders. Because quite frankly, our goal is to provide them the platform to lead and take us to places that we can't even envision right now. Because there are places and spaces that they will have to be able to walk in and take on that we have never seen before. You know, I often talk about the fact that many of us grew up when there were only 32 channels on television. Some of you all grew up when there were only 16. Some of you all remember when at 12 midnight the Star Spangled Banner would come on at the top and would go up. Right? But this is a generation that has over 800 television channels. The generation, if they're not getting it from there, they're getting it from the internet. If they're not getting it from there, they're getting it from cell phones. Processing more information in a day than many of us had to process in a month. So they have to be prepared to go and to move this equity agenda using tools and ways, taking on challenges that we have never seen before. So we have to share this role of both being supporters and being led by them. You know, it reminds me of the story of a man who was taking a ride down an old road, and drove his car in a ditch. And there was only one house by the side of the ditch, and the man went to that house and asked the guy, "Do you have anything to pull me out of the ditch?" He said, "Well, I got a mule, I'll be right out there." The man comes out there with the mule, and he hooks the mule up to the man's car, and he calls the mule's name. He said, "Otis, pull." And Otis pulls, nothing happens. The man began to say, "Well, you tried. He said, "No, give me another shot." He looked, he said, "Otis, Jeremy, pull." This time he pulled, and they pulled the car out of the ditch. The man was so amazed, he said, wait, you only had one mule. Why did you call two names? He said, "Because sometimes Otis acts a little different when he knows he has support." And for many of our young people, we've got to give them the support that they need in order for them to perform the way that we would like for them to perform, to do the things that we need for them to do. And I get it. It's very frustrating. And many of us have been in many a battle over a number of years. Some of us have seen the legislation that changed in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Elementary Secondary Education Act. Some of you all were right there. And you thought that after Brown, we did it. That's all that we needed. I remember years ago during the 50th anniversary of Brown, talking to Reverend Jackson, he reminded me that Brown was a first down, not a touchdown. And many of us right now are still holding the ball. And the question that the generation is asking, are we going to fumble it or are we going to move? Are we going to play it like a team or are we going to self-destruct? So it is frustrating. It is challenging. And when I sometimes get tired, because we all get weary and we get tired, I go to a book that provides me some support and that teaches me. And I know many of you may have your different books, your different ways, different things. But for me, I go to the Bible, and I want to share a scripture with you. It comes from Mark 5. It said, "They came over unto the other side of the sea, into the country of Gadarenes. And when he was come out of the ship, immediately there met him out of the tomb a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no man could bind him, no, not with chains, because that he had been often bound with fetters and chains, and the chains had been plucked asunder by him, and the fetters broken in pieces. Neither could any man tame him. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying and cutting himself with stones. But when he saw Jesus afar off, he ran and worshipped him, and cried with a loud voice and said, What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God that thou torment me not. For he said unto him, Come out of the man, thou unclean spirit. And he asked him, What is thy name? And he answered, saying, My name is Legion, for we are many. This is very important because to me, as I read this text and this scripture over and over, it provided me some guidance on many of the challenges that we see in our cities today. We said in the story, we see a man, a young boy who is living in a tomb, who's living among the dead. I don't know how this young man got there. The story doesn't tell the route, the decisions that the young man made to get there. It doesn't say whether the young man was a part of a school that had been closed. It doesn't say whether the man was in a school but pushed out of the school. It only says that the destination, the end result, was that this young man was found in a tomb. But yet it also says that there was someone who was willing to go to that place. Someone who was willing to stop by and thought enough of this young man to spend his time with him. How many of you all know that we can't help people that we're not willing to reach? And often, reaching them doesn't mean that we can stay in the comforts of our neighborhood, within the comforts of our agendas, within the comforts of our mission. But it means reaching out in a way that we have never seen before. Because this man was in a tomb. In many respects, he was in a place, a cemetery, a place where the dead live. And for far too often, our communities have been criticized and are being criticized because of what is happening. And I submit that our challenge is not just what's happening in our community, but whether or not those within the community are going to act like they live in the tomb or bring people from the tomb. And quite frankly, we've got too many organizations who are behaving like they're supposed to live in the cemetery. Their agendas, their organizations, their missions, just everywhere, dead people. And in fact, they're good intentions, but our goal is to bring a living agenda that we're able to reach not just those with the 4.0s, not just those with the 3.5, but able to reach all students. And this is what this man did. Our agenda is to reach out in not an area of criticism, but an area of support. This is why I'm happy to hear about our need to recruit more teachers of color. Because they are the people that often have the context and the bridge that's necessary to connect with the young people, regardless of where the communities exist. However, I will say this. We also have to recognize, though, that there are places like New Orleans, there are places like Baltimore, where you see a higher percentage of teachers of color, but you still have the disparities in suspensions and expulsions. So there is something else that's still going on there. There is a cultural gap. There's a generation gap that we must understand how, while we address the need to recruit more teachers of color, how then do we also address the need to train all teachers in addressing the generation gap that exists. And this is a role that institutions of higher education have to take on. Cannot prepare a teacher without preparing a teacher on being able to identify his or her own implicit bias. And a teacher can go through right now a school of education and not receive training. So at the same time, if they miss it in the schools of education, the question is, what happens in insert this training that will allow us to give it to them at that point? So my point is, yes, we want to be focused on increasing the number of teachers of color, but in a broader way, we want to be focused on providing the types of systematic training and supports that are necessary so that teachers can teach all students. Because quite frankly, you might be a good teacher on the south side of Chicago, but if I was to drop you in Boise, Idaho, there's a different level of training that you have to receive. And our goal is to provide a system where all students have a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. And I recognize that there are numbered, hear me right, I'm not being critical of organizations. I'm not being critical of people who are doing the work. I'm saying that we've got to continue to be strategic. So like this Baptist preacher who invited another preacher to his church, and the preacher asked him, how many good members do you have? He said, oh, I got about 1,000 good members. He said, great, I can't wait to come to your church. The man gets to the church, he's ready to preach. There are 11 people in the audience. Oh. 11 people. He leaned over to the pastor. He said, hey, man, I thought you told me you had 1,000 good members. He said, I do. Some of them are good for something and others are good for nothing, but they're all good. Now, I'm glad to be here with those who are good for something, but we still got to work with those who are not as good as you are, because that's a critical part of this agenda. But I see something else in this story. In this story, I see the fact that the man was no longer, the young boy was no longer in chains. He had broken through the chains. He had struggled. Some might have said he was disobedient. Some might have said he was misbehaving. because the system had set it up that if we put you in a tomb, if we put chains on you, you're supposed to behave like you're locked in chains. But this young man, probably being more aggressive than those who desired to save them, had broke the chains. But it's important to note that although he was unchained, he still wasn't free. And in many respects, that's the challenge that we're dealing with our communities. There are those who say these young people have more opportunities than we ever had. These young people should just do better. If they just pulled up their pants, if they just did this. They're not chained. They're not chained. But yet we recognize and we've got to continue to elevate the perspective that they're still not free. Because to the degree that we know that young people are being pushed out of schools, and there's clear data and evidence that says that when you suspend a young person, it increases the likelihood that they're going to be pushed out. We know this. So our question is, and our accountability is, how do we get rid of that policy? Not, we would like for you to just reduce it. Eliminate it. Eliminate it. And say it boldly. And I'm not saying it from a perspective of those cases where there are students bringing guns, those cases where there are drugs for distribution. Those are covered by the federal law. Those are 4% of the cases. I'm talking about the other 96% that leads to an outcome where we're able to predict by race and gender who's more likely to be suspended, who's more likely to be expelled. And I'm not saying eliminate it without also providing the support so teachers can teach and students can learn. Because quite frankly, I've never met a teacher. You may have, but I've never met a teacher who said, I'm going into the teaching profession so I can kick kids out. I haven't. I've met a number of teachers who didn't have the supports necessary to teach all students. So as a community, our challenge becomes, how do we identify those supports? How do we identify those policies and practices? Because that's what it comes down to. There's clear biological data that indicates that regardless of race or ethnicity, we're 99.6% the same. In fact, there are more genes to explain the variance in our eye color than our racial or ethnic differences. So to the degree that we're 99.6% the same, any educational outcomes that are identifiable by race or ethnicity are not caused by the racial or ethnic differences, but the social policies and social practices which lead to those differences. And in our communities across the country, we've got to identify those social policies, as you have. Out of school suspension doesn't work to provide all students an opportunity to learn. We've got to pick sides, as Jitu said, and be bold about saying, let's eliminate it. Solutions, not suspensions. Be bold about it. You may sound like you're on the outlier. You may sound like people will say, you're crazy. Yes, you've got to be crazy enough to believe that all students can have a substantive opportunity to learn. You know, a revolutionary is anyone who swims against the tide. And the tide right now says kick out. The tide right now says expel. The tide right now says incarcerated. But we've got to say something. So embrace the fact that you are a revolutionary. And if you can't embrace that and embrace what comes with that, you might be in the wrong line of business. Because in order to be successful in this business, you've got to draw the line. This man walked past and he didn't ask the man, where were your parents? Why did your parents fail you? He didn't ask, what bad decisions did you make? Why did you end up in this tomb? But he recognized that the man needed support. And he reached out and he supported him. But I also noted that it said that day and night the man was cutting himself. Cutting himself. There was a level of pain. And often the narrative is in our communities, the pain that we feel is more self-inflicted than systemic. And we've got to reject that. We've got to ask the question, What are the systemic challenges that create the dynamics where a community feels, or a group of young people feel, that violence is only a part of the capital assets that they have of expression? What creates the conditions by which violence becomes an asset? Well, it's hard for us to imagine because we often don't live in those conditions. What creates the condition where you don't feel safe enough to choose another route? This man is cutting himself every night, day and night. At the same time, in our systems we see and we're focused on the cuts that happen at a higher level, day and night. Cuts of education budgets, cuts of wraparound support budgets. And my thing is, let's not focus so much on the cuts that we forget about the healing. Don't focus on the cuts or the narrative around the cuts that you forget to articulate what's necessary for the overall healing. Because quite frankly, if we don't heal, there will be more cuts day and night. What is behind the cuts? What is behind those cuts? What do we need? We understand that many of the challenges that our young people face go beyond just the schoolhouse. That's why when Brother Jitu says that we've got to bring in other movements, he's absolutely right. There are young people who have academic challenges, socio-emotional challenges, and health challenges. And what is our plan for giving them the supports that are necessary to meet those challenges? We often at the Schott Foundation talk about if we just gave every student what we call a personal opportunity plan. We often say we want to save all children, but let's even change the perspective. We want to save each child. What's necessary for each child? And for some, it may be additional academic supports, tutoring, extended day, year-round schooling, ELL supports. Others, it may be additional socio-emotional supports. There's clear data that indicates having a mentor actually helps. And I'm not just talking about a mentor, and I appreciate people who do it on a volunteer base. Let's not just talk about a mentor, but if we believe and know that it works, it should be paid for out of the state and city coffers. Because it's a part of what's necessary. I know some would say, well, how do we do that? You know, the budget's tight, we're coming out of a recession, but yet we pay for probationary officers out of this. And meaning we are paying for them to lead our young people in places that it costs us more to keep them there. So it seems like that we would be a part of those people that say, well, if you invest in the front end, you reduce the number of beds that you will need on the back end, and there's a cost saving. Let's do opportunity budgeting instead of oppressive budgeting. Additional academic, socio-emotional, and health supports. We can identify the health challenges which serve as barriers to a student's opportunity to learn. Asthma, eyesight, mental health. Let's ensure that each child has access to those resources. It's going to take a lot of collaboration. It's going to take rethinking a new system. So I'm happy about the work that they're doing down in Mississippi with the One Mississippi Ballot Initiative that will impact the entire state. Now it's going to be on the ballot next November, and hopefully we're going to be thinking and strategizing, and the Schott Foundation is going to get behind it, but thinking collectively how we get that ballot initiative passed. But constantly thinking through collectively how we change systems, not just the outcomes for a few students, but what is it that we can do to change the system. Finally, what I think that is most compelling is even after this man healed this young man, he asked him, "What is your name? What is your name?" And he asked it not to the young man, but the unclean spirit that was in it. And as I read that, it became clear to me that when you are up against a demon, you've got to name that demon. You've got to name it. Some of us like to beat around the bush, keep our political connections, stay in the limelight, but sometimes you've got to name who you're up against. Sometimes, and the young man said, well, legion, because I am many. some of you all may say, when you ask what is your name, the person may say, I'm Brown. The other person might say, I'm Governor Cuomo. Someone else might say, I'm Mayor Landry. Someone else might say a different name, but you've got to name the demon that you're up against, whether it's a cult purpose, whether it's a colonization, but you've got to be very specific. Otherwise, a person will give the appearance of being a friend while working against us. We've got to choose our sides. We've got to choose our sides. And as I take my seat, because I'm at my 20-minute period what it gave me, I do think it's important that you all have the time that's necessary to strategize, because that's the power. Power is not just going to come in one speech and one march, but it's going to come in a consistent strategy and the consistent cooperation that's necessary to bring about the change. So time is neutral. It can be used for good or bad. And to the degree that it is not used for good, it becomes an ally for evil. Time is neutral. And the question that we are asking right now, what are we going to be doing with our next few moments? But one thing that we do know, the time for justice is now. The time for end suspicion is now. The time for resource equity is now. The time to institutionalize love is now. Because at the core of everything that we're dealing with is racism. At the core of racism is institutionalized lovelessness. Because you wouldn't allow those who you love to go hungry. You wouldn't kick out those who you love. So the challenge that we're up against is, how do we institutionalize love in a world that is built on hate? And we are the people who know how to institutionalize love, and the time is now. Time is neutral, but I believe we got everything that we need to do the job. The only question is, are we going to work together? Are we going to push together? Are we going to fight together? Are we going to push one another together? Are we going to spend the time that's necessary to provide all students an opportunity to learn? God bless you.